Slozgo Olzul, or the universes of legends in the common tongue, houses many mysteries, peoples, and stories. It was so named by the dwarves after their picks first pierced the rocky surface of the land, reaching fresh air and the starry skies above for the first time. Surely each scintillating speck in the night sky above was the domain of a soul, of a now long forgotten dwarf of skill or some renown. Surely each one their own universe. After all, the world of those first dwarves had been so small, sandwiched between the dangers of the caverns too far below, and solid stone on either side that could take years of labor to expand. Many years have now passed since those first days, back when humans and elves were not even rumors to the inhabitants of the smooth, labyrinthian caves nestled deep within the ground. Since that time, the dwarves have learned to trade and cohabit with their taller, shorter-lived counterparts, the humans. They have come to give a respectful distance to the elves whose strange fascination with the conservation of tall trunks of timber that carpet the land has led to many a dispute in the past. They have come in contact with beast races, goblins, and even the undead, whose callous and cruel habit of infecting the races they come in contact with has led to the dwarves' latest and biggest challenge. In the southwestern portion of the known world, carved deeply into the very spine of the mountain range that resides on the main continent, the kingdom of the Lucky Flags resides. Under the honorable and virtuous leadership of Mebzus Dudibronze, the population, counting well over 4,100 dwarves, has been booming so much that they've spread into over 40 settlements in the past few years, many of which have grown and prospered as they open new trade routes to the wider world, some of which were less fortunate. All dwarves in the mountain home have now heard of the ill-fated establishment of the Temple of Ceramiseth by the brothers of the God of Spurting. More than one expedition has since been sent in an attempt to secure those roads for passing trade caravans to the human lands, but to date none have succeeded in establishing a permanent presence in the area. The threat that the walking dead pose in the region remains too vast to this day. As for the dwarves, it seems that adaptation takes time for such obstinate creatures, but necessity is the mother of invention, and as the darkness of necromancer towers spread in the lands to the east, some more pragmatic dwarves have taken to trying new strategies to survive in the lands of Slozgo Olzul. If you would be so kind as to permit me to recount a story, I would tell you of the fortress we now refer to as Bisòldural, Peaceful Honor. Established by a group of rather uncommon dwarves who've looked out into a world fraught with danger and evil and decided to take a route away from violence and go not to the east or south, but to the north. The mountain range that the Lucky Flags called home spanned a large portion of the continent's height from north to south. Many of the peaks here reach the highest points in the world, or so it is said. The Lucky Flags are mainly focused in the southern portion of the range. The northernmost tips are home to another civilization whose noble history and legends we will keep for another time. The portion that interests us today is the central span of the Cordelia, where the wide chain slims and hugs around a section of sandy deserts that finds themselves nestled within a protective embrace of the sky-piercing peaks. Though it is true that the life-bringing clouds coming in from the western oceans rarely seem to reach this rain-shadowed desert, life and water can still be found here. For you see, the snow-capped hills to the south of the sand slowly and steadily melt over time, releasing water in slow-moving trickles that flow down the slopes. These trickles eventually find each other as the rivulets meander down the stony and barren lands, merging together and turning into proper brooks. Most of the hardy plants and wildlife in this region relies on this gift from up high to cling on to life, and it's this same boon that brought the first settlers to the region. At a place where the ice melts have dug a canyon into the stone, near where the hills flatten out into a long stretching plateau, where stone, sand, and hardy grasses mix. 7 dwarves have decided this to be an ideal location to get away from the menace of the south and to embrace a peaceful lifestyle. Though the 7 friends had no clear hierarchy amongst them, one of the group, a female named Mistum Regagnum, found herself the de facto expedition leader. A rather square-faced dwarf with high cheekbones and a narrow nose, Mistum tends to walk with a spring in her step, leaving her short, golden, curly hair bounce along behind her. After such a long trek far from their mountain home, her skin has taken on the color of copper, and her silken tunic has dirtied significantly, none of which has erased the smile that crinkles the skin near her amethyst-colored eyes. With her deep well of patience, a great sense of empathy, a very good feel for social relationships, a sometimes blinding amount of overconfidence in herself, and an admitted lack of labor-related skills, she had been the one to convince the others of this venture in the first place. She was the one who chose the location for their new settlement, claiming that the canyons and brooks was a gift from Reknas Segal themselves, her preferred deity. Her reasoning was that if they were to dig into the stone on either side and lay a drawbridge between the 2 openings, the gorge would act as a near impenetrable moat. If they were to be visited by necromantic horrors, all they needed to do would be to raise the bridge and wait until they lost interest. The group laid out an overly ambitious plan of how they hoped their new fortress would take shape, the kind of plan born out of the naivete that comes with the optimism of the time before pick meets stone. A place some way up the hill was chosen for the opening of the tunnel that would lead to an abrupt fall down to the babbling brook below. A temporary stone bridge would span the distance to the other side, using the stone excavated on their way there. A precarious construction for sure, but it would only be in use until a proper bridge could be built. Dwarves are master stonecrafters, after all. The idea of such bridges was not a new one to any present. On the opposite side of the canyon, a space was planned for a temporary dormitory so that they can enjoy the cover of stone above their heads once more. The night skies above ground may be beautiful to behold, but any good dwarf prefers the safety of the deep. To the south of this, a large meeting and dining hall was planned out with an adjacent kitchen and storeroom. Following the main corridor westward, it would come to a stop at a large stone room with stairs leading down on all corners. The idea was to allow better communication between the separate levels of the fortress, one that was used frequently in the newer construction projects by the Lucky Flags. Heading to the north, almost reaching the side of the sand-covered mountains, was a long corridor to what was hoped to be an area perfect for farming, far above the more fertile yet much more dangerous caverns that may lie below. Coming back to the square junction and communication area, and heading down, space would be reserved for storerooms and crafting tables to work the various stones and wood that was brought along on this journey north. 2 miners were selected amongst the lot to begin the digging, the first of which was Morun Goslilinen. His curly brown hair was touched with grey at the age of 85. His moustache was braided into his long beard, which hung on either side of his face. The burnt umber of his skin made his brass-colored eyes stand out from under his heavy eyebrows. He wore cave silk clothing that was permanently stained with dirt, clay, and a dust of stone. He was a classic dwarf in that his interests included drinking alcohol, which he jokingly stated needing to get through the working day, and mining stone. He was also quite patient, which would come in useful as he showed the ropes of mining to a newcomer to the trade, Dishmab al-Moshlogem. Dishmab had no prior experience of mining before arriving in Bisòldural, but was familiar with the working of stone in the form of engraving, stone cutting, and stone carving. For this reason, he was the obvious choice for the second miner of the colony. Dishmab was younger than Marul by over 20 years. His coiled, burnt umber hair had, as of yet, no trace of grey or white, and seemed to cascade around his shoulders like a fountain. All of his long facial hair was neatly arranged into 2 braids that hung on either side of his face. His skin was copper and his eyes emerald green. His clothing, unlike the previous two mentioned, was made of pigtail fiber and wool. He was not gifted with much self-confidence, but Marul was certain that he would make a fine miner out of Dishmab in no time. The pair set to work without hesitation, the mountain of labor seeming like a slight mound in the face of the expectation of a comfortable home to call their own. Their picks were swung at the sandstone walls of the cliffside. The clay and sedimentary rock broke off in chunks, making the work of digging out a passage fairly easygoing. It was a perfect stone for Dishmab to learn on, or so Marul stated, and the orange tint of the stone itself would have a striking appearance for an entryway once their labor complete. For now, the cavernous opening into the fort would remain roughly cut as, though optimistic about their progress, it was not lost on either of the two how much digging would still need to be done before they could move into their new home. They worked diligently on the first span of stone until they broke through the rough canyon wall, Marul's experience showing as he seemed to know better than to throw his weight at the last few inches of stone, lest he fell into the gaping gorge below. The next step was to erect a temporary sandstone bridge that would span the gap to the other side and allow them to continue digging into the hillside proper. Simple and precarious though it may be, the bridge that Marul insisted on being the architect for took little time to be laid down. While the elder dwarf was busy with the erection of the temporary canyon spanning link, Dishmab took on the task of carving out the future site for trade caravans to stop by. One might say that this was a bit premature, as only a handful of dwarves in the homeland had even known of their trek northwards, but the large and simple room would prove to be a wealth of experience for the novice miner. With the temporary construction assembled, the true work of digging out the hillside began. Looking down from the precarious perch, the babbling brook might seem like little comfort for any dwarf hoping for a soft fall should the worst come to pass. The last sunbeams of a setting sun made the riverstones sparkle where they poked from the waterline, reminding them of the starry afterlife that awaits them should one foot slip and their heads fall to an early grave. No time to ponder such dilemmic distractions, however. Their home wouldn't carve itself, and as the twin miners bore their way into the sandstone, they discovered cause for momentary commendations, as discovery of chalkstone marked a milestone in the future expansion of the fortress. Such salient flux-stone could be used in the removal of the oxide films that keep iron from becoming steel, though so far all metals used in their rudimentary tools that followed them on their voyage were copper in origin. Due to the necessity of reining in costs, steel would certainly mark a noticeable improvement for the dwarves. The first room to be carved out was one that would eventually be utilized as a common chapel for their spiritual and metaphysical needs, but would in the interim be used for much more earthly purposes, lest you consider dreams to be of divine nature. Just south of the dormitory and future temple, next to the envisioned drawbridge, a small stone nook was carved out to act as a future home for the lever that would control the eagerly anticipated moving contraption that would see friendly dwarves to safety and hostile entities denied entry. One might assume at this point the diggers would move on to the south, but they instead pointed their aspirations to the west, towards the future yawning stone communication cavity that was in vogue in modern dwarf edifice. They spent little hesitation in exhuming the cavernous construction, but it was here where Marul made his first mistake. In his excitement for the ample progress they had shown, and in the bounding advancements in Dishmab's mining experience, he hadn't realized until it was too late that the central portion of what was meant to be an open space had become utterly disconnected from the surrounding stone. This left a rather chunky section of overhanging sandstone hanging like a stalactite over the rectangular room, To ease his frustration and to give him time to consider solutions to this dilemma, the miners headed to the north instead. Through orange sandstone and milk-white chalk rock, they carved a passage through the hills until they reached a portion where the solid turned to sediment, and sandy soil was found in abundance enough for a cave-dwelling fungi to take mycelial root. Here, in the northernmost portion of the underground settlement, they would grow plump helmets, a resilient and versatile purple toadstool that is known for being rather, well, plump. This crop was indeed a staple of dwarven gastronomy, not just in that it is edible, but also because it can be brewed into that delightfully delectable of dwarven drinks, alcohol. No doubt this was the line of thought when Marul turned his pick towards the future farmlands of the fortress. The next room to get excavated was the most important room in any dwarven settlement, or so any lover of drink and food would claim, the dining hall. Much of the digging went as similarly smoothly as most of the rest, though being the largest room so far, the main body of the almost rectangular space was meant to encompass both a dining area with tables and chairs, as well as a meeting hall of sorts where dwarves could talk, sing, and generally socialize. A small opening in the south of the room was to lead to the kitchens and storeroom, where uncooked ingredients could rest and wait to be turned into all manner of tummy-filling pleasure in the future. Once this room was dug, Mistem gave the green light for the group to start moving into their new abode underground. A kitchen was slated for construction so that food might be prepared. A still was set nearby for the brewing of wine, beer, and ale. A fishery was planned in the room as well, as some of the dwarves had already taken to fishing in a nearby brook. Might as well benefit from the bounty of the nearby stream. A dwarf can't live off mushrooms alone, after all. A stockpile was set near the group of workshops for ease of access of unprepared edible materials. Near the farmlands to the north, another area was planned for the storage of plant seeds. The group's planter would surely benefit from this thoughtful placement once the ground got tilled. Going back to the dining area, spaces were specially selected for prepared food and drink, lest the laborers have to walk too far from their tables to gather what they craved. One level down from here, where Marul's misstep was less evident, the dwarves set up spaces to store stone and lumber that would prove invaluable in the creation of furnished goods. Next to these storerooms, 4 workshops were built, a stone worker's workshop for turning raw stone into blocks, as well as all manner of other goods, a mechanic's workshop to create the gears and components required for the drawbridge, a carpenter's station for the working of wood and the creation of the long-anticipated beds, and finally, a craft dwarf's workshop. The latter of the quad would be used for making simple stone jewelry that the dwarves would be able to trade with future passing caravans. It was during the construction of these workshops when Marul was struck with a sudden thought. The unsightly suspended source of his frustration could be used as an office of sorts for Mistem, who had taken to managing work orders, keeping inventory, and discussing the group's various ideas, grievances, and needs. The Forgotten Stone area would be the perfect place for this, not only being central to the hustle and bustle of their subterranean life, but in an ideal spot for keeping tabs on what work orders was still underway and which was done. A short span of flooring was quickly planned out to link the central structure with the rest of the fortress. A cavity filled the interior of the stone, and floors and walls were smoothed out to give it a more polished and finished look. Surely furniture and decorations were to follow, but here is where we will leave this tale for today. We'll pick things up where we left off, I promise, though when, I cannot say. Until then, my friends, goodbye.